On July 23, 1983, an Air Canada Boeing 767 cruises high over central Canada on what should have been a routine cross-country flight. Then suddenly, a warning light illuminates inside the cockpit. Low fuel pressure. The crew now faces a terrifying possibility. Both engines are starving for fuel. Within seconds, the left engine flames out, then the right. The Boeing 767 instantly transforms into a powerless glider weighing over 130 tons. The cockpit screens go dark. The cabin falls eerily silent. Below them sits an abandoned runway, now being used as a racetrack, crowded with families and children. Neither the people on the ground nor the pilots above realize they are about to collide. This is the story of Air Canada Flight 143. Air Canada Flight 143 departs Montreal with stops planned in Ottawa before continuing west to Edmonton, Alberta. The aircraft is one of Air Canada's brand new Boeing 767s, an advanced wide-body jet introduced only months earlier. In command is a highly experienced pilot with over 15,000 flight hours. Beside him sits a former Royal Canadian Air Force pilot familiar with air bases across Canada. The Boeing 767 represented a new era of aviation technology. Unlike older aircraft, it operated with only 2 pilots instead of 3. But hidden behind the aircraft's modern design was a dangerous chain of maintenance problems, calculation errors, and confusion surrounding Canada's transition from imperial to metric measurements. And by the time Flight 143 pushed back from the gate, the aircraft already carried only half the fuel required for the journey. The disaster began the previous day when maintenance technicians discovered a fault in the aircraft's fuel quantity information system. The malfunction caused the cockpit fuel gauges to go blank. Under Air Canada procedures, the aircraft could still legally fly if technicians manually measured the fuel inside the tanks using drip sticks beneath the wings. Those measurements had to be converted from liters into fuel weight before calculating how much fuel to add. And that's where everything went wrong. At the time, Canada was transitioning from pounds to kilograms. Older Air Canada aircraft used pounds. The new Boeing 767 used kilograms. But the technicians and flight crew mistakenly used the wrong fuel conversion factor for pounds instead of kilograms. The result was catastrophic. The crew believed the aircraft carried over 22,000 kilograms of fuel. In reality, it carried barely half that amount, enough fuel for only about 2 hours of flight. But because the fuel gauges were inoperative, the incorrect numbers were manually entered into the flight management computer. No warning appeared, no system caught the mistake, and Air Canada Flight 143 departed Ottawa carrying 69 people with almost no margin for error. Several hours later, cruising over northern Manitoba, the cockpit warnings begin. First, the left fuel pump pressure warning, then the right. Captain Pearson immediately diverts toward Winnipeg, but the situation deteriorates rapidly. Passengers notice the engines growing quieter. Then, the left engine shuts out completely. Seconds later, the right follows. At 35,000 feet, the Boeing 767 loses all engine power. The generators fail. Most cockpit instruments go dark. The aircraft's transponder disappears from radar. The crew now has only basic flight instruments remaining. No engines, no navigation computers, no powered flaps, no second chance. Captain later described the moment with a single word: "Oh." Initially, the crew believed they can glide to Winnipeg, but calculations quickly reveal a terrible reality. They are losing altitude too quickly. They will never make it. That's when First Officer Quintal suggests an alternative, a former Royal Canadian Air Force Base at Gimli. The runway is long enough for the Boeing 767, but neither pilot knows the airport has partially been converted into a public racetrack. On the ground, families gather beside the old runway for a weekend racing event. Children ride bicycles across the pavement, campers line the edge of the strip, barbecues burn in the evening sun, and overhead, a silent Boeing 767 descends toward them. Inside the cockpit, the crew faces another crisis. Without engine power, the aircraft cannot extend flaps normally. The landing gear must be released manually, but one indication light remains red. The nose gear may not be locked. Passengers stare out the windows in terror as the aircraft banks aggressively toward the runway. People on the ground finally notice the silent airliner approaching directly overhead. At the last possible moment, Captain straightens the aircraft and aims for runway 32 left. The Boeing 767 crosses the threshold very fast, very fast. The main landing gear slams onto the runway roughly 800 feet beyond the threshold. The pilots immediately apply maximum braking. Seconds later, 2 tires explode. Then the unsecured nose gear collapses. The aircraft's nose scrapes violently along the runway, but that collapsing nose gear unintentionally helps slow the aircraft. Ahead, Captain suddenly spots 2 boys riding bicycles directly on the runway. The captain swerves slightly as the powerless airliner roars toward them. The boys escape only seconds before impact. Finally, the Boeing 767 grinds to a stop less than 1,000 feet from the campground filled with spectators. Against all odds, every single person on board survives, and nobody on the ground is killed. Investigators later determined that the accident resulted from a chain of human and organizational failures. Maintenance personnel, fuelers, and flight crew all unknowingly used the wrong fuel conversion factor during calculations. Air Canada's transition to metric measurements had created confusion throughout the airline, and critical responsibilities once handled by flight engineers had not been clearly reassigned after the Boeing 767 entered service. But despite the failures leading to the emergency, the extraordinary skill of Captain Pearson and First Officer Quintal prevented what could have become one of the deadliest aviation disasters in Canadian history. The aircraft later returned to service and continued flying passengers for decades, and Air Canada Flight 143 became legendary in aviation history, remembered forever as the Gimli Glider.
Learn more about aviation safety. Subscribe for more investigation videos.